All right. Now, most of us hate remembering our mistakes, right? That's one of those things that usually causes a lot of problems in a marriage or any relationship. When somebody says to you, hey, you remember that time that you did that awful thing? If they bring up something that you've done in the past, that's usually a good recipe for someone to have hard feelings at you really quick. What are the historical mistakes that you can think of? What are the big ones that kind of stand out to you of sometimes that somebody really messed up?
The Treaty of Versailles, which was used to end World War I.
Okay.
However, because of how unfair it was and because they put too much emotions in it, it basically said World War II was going to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So absolutely. Anytime that we don't have winning the peace, as some historians like to call it, if we don't have victory and peace, then we're going to have the setup for the next war. Anybody else? Any major historical mistakes that you can think of? I think it's something like the Hindenburg. If I just mentioned that word, everybody knows immediately what that is. I mean, even if you're not into history, you've heard of this giant, crazy airship that bursts into fire.
Titanic.
Yeah, the Titanic. There are some of these words that all you have to say is one single word, and everybody immediately goes to it. General Custer, yeah, Battle of Little Bighorn, all of the death of our cavalrymen out there. Absolutely.
When the five people just went on a submarine.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
What is the name of that submarine?
Ocean Gate.
Ocean Gate sub. Yeah, yeah. The carbon fiber sub that just imploded. What was it, last year? 2 years?
Yeah, last year.
Time moves really quick for me sometimes, and so I can never remember if it's a historical event in the last couple of years. I have a hard time remembering if it was 6 months ago or 5 years ago. It really gets confusing in my head there. But yeah.
I think of two times in the Navy, the couple of carriers. Part of it was accident. Part of it was they shouldn't have done some things. That fires they had on it.
Yeah.
And, fires on a carrier with all this equipment, planes. That's expensive. But,
Yeah.
it was partly an accident. It was partly they could have caused it. It was a cause.
Yeah.
So it's a. I think Enterprise was one of them. I think.
Okay.
Several years ago.
Yeah.
Forstall.
Yeah. But so those things stand out to you, right? Whenever somebody brings those up, they really are obvious. Why does God make it so we remember mistakes so sharply?
It's so we don't make that same mistake again.
Yeah. It's not really designed for you to bring it up to somebody else and stab them with it, right? That's not why God gave us those memories. He gave us those memories so that we can learn from it, so that we can understand it.
My brother would remember mistakes I made, and I think he did it on purpose.
Sure. I mean, that's very common in our relationships. We know, even if you're a really saintly person, everybody knows that one of the best ways to get back at somebody is to remind them of a time that they did something stupid. Remind them of a time that they really messed up. If you really failed and you really want to make somebody feel low, you say, hey, you remember last January? Because I sure do. That was a really funny time, or you really looked stupid that time.
Satan's good at doing that.
Absolutely, he is. And so we know that mistakes are things that we would usually rather move on from. And we're moving on from Abraham's life, right? Last week in our story, we buried him. We were in Genesis 25 and we said, all right, we're moving on past Abraham's life. But the wonderful thing is that we don't just pick up with Isaac after having buried Abraham and move on with the promised son as if nothing had ever happened. Instead, we get reminded that Abraham and Sarah messed up. So right after we bury Abraham, God says, okay, so Abraham's in the ground now, and just in case you forgot, they made a mistake. Now, the consequences of Abraham's life, they keep going after he's dead, right? We understand that in a positive way, right? We all sing the little children's song, Father Abraham had many sons. We understand the positive consequences of Abraham's life, but the negative consequences of his life, just like all of us, that the consequences of your life keep going after you die. Sometimes people think about that and they say, well, once I'm in the ground, I won't have to worry about that anymore. Well, you're probably right. I think in heaven, you probably won't be worrying about it. But there are things that you do today that are going to matter even if you're in the ground. There are things that are going to keep going on even after you have passed. And those include your mistakes. And we don't really like that idea. But there it is, right in the scripture. Abraham is dead, and here comes God saying, here it is, the mistake that Abraham made. So can somebody read for us Genesis 25, 12 through 18? That's 25, 12 through 18. If you haven't looked ahead before you volunteer, it's mostly names. So if you're a person who doesn't want the names, here they are. Hannah's ready for the names.
12 through 18.
That's right.
This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's slave Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael listed in the order of their birth. Oh no. Wow.
You were warned.
Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Abdil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Masa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Nephish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt as you go towards Ashur. And they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them.
All right. So, this is a typical order of things in Scripture. Someone dies, and just like today, when someone dies in the obituary, you don't just say, so-and-so died, put it in the newspaper. You say, these are the people who are left behind, right? In an obituary, it's almost always that you have this person died, these are the people that are related to them that are still living. And just like modern obituaries, sometimes there's messiness in the family tree, right? Every now and then you'll read an obituary. Sometimes those late night comedians used to like to read those where they would bring up obituaries and they would tell you, whoa, somebody really didn't like somebody else because they wrote it in the newspaper that I didn't like this person. Now, we all kind of remember Ishmael's birth, right? Everybody in here remembers that Sarah and Abram decided to get together and get Hagar, this woman servant, to surrender her body and become a concubine to Abram so that they could circumvent God's plan and have a child a little faster than what God expected. And they said, we're going to come up with our own idea. We're going to have a child through Hagar. Now, the last we had seen before Abraham's death of Ishmael was back in chapter 21. His mother had found him an Egyptian wife, and then he was living in the wilderness, and he's a great bow hunter. And that's really all we get about this guy. He's out here in the wilderness, married to an Egyptian, and I've got a photo here of this wilderness that we have in Genesis 21. We're told he lives in the wilderness of Paran, and that's what that looks like. So it doesn't look super attractive. Doesn't look like the kind of place you would necessarily build a resort. You're not going to put that in the travel brochure. That's where he is, bow hunting something. I assume there was a lot more game there at that point than there is today. But he's been thrown out of his home for disrespect, right? If you remember that story in Genesis chapter 21, something happens where Isaac is being weaned. He's a very young man, and Ishmael, for some reason, decides to disrespect Isaac. And Sarah says, we can't keep having this. This can't keep going on, Abraham. You got to do something. And so Abraham is instructed by the Lord, send them out. And that's what they do. Abraham sends them out into this wilderness, and he ends up growing up there and living in this very difficult place. Now, there are a lot of situations in families where people can't live together, right? All of a sudden, something gets said, something gets done, and people that were perfectly content to live together yesterday can't live together today. There's a problem, and you can't go forward together. And when that happens, when somebody gets kind of kicked out of the family, kicked at least away from the homestead, it's kind of easy to put them out of your mind, right? If you've got somebody who has done something that was really bad, said something that was really bad, and you have to push them away from your life, it's a little easier to just stop thinking about them. Because if you think about them, it gets really painful, right? When you've got that kind of connection that's been severed, it's very painful to think about them and I wonder how they're doing. I wonder if they need anything. You can kind of drive yourself crazy that way. But God never forgets anyone. There's never a point where he sets you aside and says, I'm not interested in how they're doing. God never puts you to the side and thinks, I'll come back and check on them a little later on. It doesn't matter how inconvenient or how annoying or how hurtful or even how evil a person is, God always pays attention to them. Now, if you know the story of Ishmael well, you'll remember that the Lord had made his father a promise. What did God promise Abraham about Ishmael?
Make him into a nation.
Yeah, he would make him into a nation, make him have many offspring. In Genesis 17:20, it says, As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Can we get somebody to read verse 16 in chapter 25 again?
Hold on, give me a single
You're just fine.
second.
Verse 16.
These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers, according to their settlements and camps.
So, in chapter 17, God said, your son Ishmael, that you want to be the line of the promise, he's going to have 12 princes. And then we get to chapter 25, and God says, here is the evidence. Here is the proof that I came through on my promise. I think that's very important when you're reading Scripture and you see a fulfillment of a promise of God, that you take note and you say, God keeps his promises. There is never a point where God decides, I'll come back to that later. He knows what he's doing with his promise and when he's going to fulfill it. And so he has kept his promise to Abraham and to Ishmael. And verse 18 makes it sound like he's a pretty difficult guy. Now, Hannah's translation, what was your version? You think NIV. That sounds about right. I've got a comparison here of verse 18 because it's a very hard verse for the translators. They translate that a lot of different ways. And on our screen here, I've got a couple at the top here that sound pretty normal and peaceful, where it says he settled down alongside of all his people, or he died in the presence of his brethren. But then it gets a little worse, like Hannah with the NIV, and they lived in hostility toward all the tribes around them, or he settled in defiance of all his relatives, or he settled over against all his kinsmen. Those are quite different, right? To settle beside somebody or to settle in opposition to somebody is a very different idea. But we're helped in trying to figure out what's going on here when we remember that God didn't just make a promise to Abraham. Before the promise to Abraham, he made a promise to Ishmael's mother, Hagar. In chapter 16, verse 12, God said to Hagar, when Hagar is running away and says, I don't want to live in this situation anymore because of how bad it is at home, God says to Hagar, Ishmael shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin. Just what we said, right? We just said, chapter 17, God promises, I am going to give him 12 princes. Chapter 25, 12 princes. Chapter 16, God promised he is going to live in opposition to all of his family. And here in chapter 25, it says exactly that. Here's Ishmael living in opposition to all of his family. And that's a pretty rough description, right? A wild ass of a man. I had several of you pretty upset about that idea because we're in church, right? But God is saying, this is what this man is going to be. It sounds like something you'd say before you get in a fight, right? If you're just walking around down the street and you say to somebody, hey, you wild ass of a man, they're not going to like that. I guarantee you, it's not going to be something that makes you any friends.
Black eye immediately.
Very likely. And yet, this is what God says to a pregnant woman while she's on the run. She is fleeing away from her home in the wilderness. And God looks down to her and says, hey, to comfort you, Hagar, to bring you some peace, so that you'll know that I'm with you, let me tell you what your son's going to be like. That's quite a story, isn't it? God says, you are going to name him Ishmael. And Ishmael means God hears. So God is saying, I have heard you, Hagar. I have heard your prayer. I have seen your difficulty. The sermon that we heard several years ago about El Roi, the idea that God sees me. All of this is connected to the idea that God is intimately concerned about Hagar and Ishmael. And what he gives her is a promise that her son is going to be a ruffian. He's going to be at odds with everybody. Now, we've all known a few people like this, right? They don't last very long in church most of the time. If there's a person who's always disputing, if they're always stirring up trouble, if they're always wanting to physically fight, that's kind of tough to have in any kind of community, right? Anytime somebody just can't be at peace, it's very difficult to want to be around them. Yeah, it's just really annoying, right? It's difficult. And we see the start of this problem way back when Isaac was just being weaned, right? When he gets run off, we see that God's prophecy seems to be coming true. That Ishmael is stirring up trouble in the household while he's still 15, 16 years old. Abraham sends Ishmael away. But then last week, in verse 9 of chapter 25, we saw that Ishmael is right beside his brother Isaac at the burial of the father. Ishmael is there, right next to the family. Now, if you know anything about the ancient world, you realize there are no preservatives, right? There's no formaldehyde, there's no freezer, there's nothing you can do to keep that body fresh while you're waiting on somebody to come over. So what this tells us is if Ishmael can make it to the funeral, he has to be within a day or two at max to be able to make it there. Because an ancient funeral wasn't something you did after the body is in the ground. It's not a memorial service. This is a time where Ishmael has to be in close enough contact that Isaac or one of his messengers can say, "Hey Ishmael, Dad's dead. Get over here." And so Ishmael shows up. Now, this means they had to be in pretty peaceful contact, right? They had to be close enough that Ishmael isn't just saying, "I don't want to hear anything about this. I'm not interested in you or your family because you ran me off." It seems they had to be somewhat peaceful. Now, people can sometimes keep it together for the big events in life, right? I've been to a few funerals and weddings where people make a fool of themselves, even at those big events. But most of the time, when there's a big event, people put their differences aside. And they say, okay, whatever has gone on before, we're going to stay at peace. Because Dad is about to go in the ground, we're going to be peaceful with one another. But what about after the death of his father? After Abraham is dead and is in the ground, Ishmael would have surely had every opportunity to do whatever he wanted, right? It was surely a time to fight and live at odds with his kin. That's what God had said about him, right? God said he's going to be difficult and he's going to live at odds with all of his kin. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Genesis 16:16 tells us that. And then he lives to 175. Ishmael, we are told in verse 17, died at 137. So if you do some pretty simple math, we can see that Ishmael lived for 50 years after Abraham dies. For 50 years, 48 if you want to get technical, that Abraham has been dead and Ishmael and Isaac are still on the earth. Now, any major conflict with Isaac would have certainly been mentioned. In Genesis, we will see in the next generation, Jacob and Esau, almost every little argument that they have, it seems, we get told about. So it seems to me that if the prophecy of God that Ishmael was going to be difficult had come true with Isaac, we would have got told about it. We've already been told about the problem when Isaac was weaned. But there is no mention of that. There's no reference to Ishmael fighting with Isaac. It seems that God didn't make Ishmael to fight with Isaac. God's prophecy before Ishmael was even born was that he would be a wild ass who lives at odds with his kin. God chose to make a gruff and aggressive man, a sort of human thorn bush. Why would God create a man specifically to be difficult? This is before Ishmael's even taken a breath. God says he's going to be difficult. So that means God made him to be that way. Why? Why would God want such a person?
Test others, maybe.
Okay, test others.
You're not gonna be able to acquire large amounts of land in any crafty way if you've got everybody irritated at you.
Okay, yeah. It kind of limits your possibilities in some ways. I would argue in a way that it could push you the other direction. If you're a particularly fighting type person, you may want to expand. You may be very interested in trying to take what's not yours if you're the fighting type. There's a lot of people who fight who think they can take whatever they want.
Maybe it's the consequences of Abraham's disobedience.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I do think that there's an element that God is saying, hey, there's a negative here, even though I've heard you. But it certainly seems to me that there's a positive aspect. As I said, in chapter 16, when God is reassuring Hagar, he's saying, hey, this is what's going to happen to you. And it doesn't seem as if he's saying this in a punitive way. It doesn't seem like God's saying, hey, this is really a bad thing you did, because as far as we know, Hagar probably had very little choice in the matter. And it's her comfort.
Not so much her, but
Yeah,
Abraham.
yeah, absolutely. So I can see where you're coming from with that. But I think that there are positive aspects to Ishmael being a difficult person. And we usually don't like those types of people because they're difficult, right? As Hannah said, they're exhausting to be around. And I think that there are good reasons that God made Ishmael a prickly kind of person and his children prickly as well. And I think that's the idea that when we confront a thorn bush, we want to avoid it, right? Anytime that we have to go into some shrubbery or into a hedge that has a lot of thorns on it, most people are pretty quickly wanting to go the other direction. And we find that these 12 sons grew into 12 kingdoms exactly as God promised. And we can see on our map here where this is, as Hannah read for us there, that we are talking about from Havilah to Shur. Now, on the far east side there, just above the modern state of Kuwait, is where some people think Havilah might have been, but it basically could be anywhere in an arc from about Baghdad all the way down to the Red Sea, because there's a lot of proposed sites there. But Shur is a place that people are conveniently sure where it is. And the rest of this area, all around modern Saudi Arabia, was where Ishmael's 12 princes end up settling. Now, these Ishmaelites ended up historically, if you look at the record, they're people who wanted to fight everybody. If you go and look at the ancient battles in these areas, anybody that showed up, these 12 princes thought, hey, let's all get into a war anytime that we can. And what I think is going on here is that God has created a thorny hedge of protection right between his people to the south, east, and west. So in virtually every direction except the north, God places this hedge of the Ishmaelites. Now, any Pentecostal knows about praying for a hedge of protection, right? We've all heard that since we were 4 or 5 years old, that somebody's praying and they say, God, put a hedge of protection around them. Now, we love picturing a thorny hedge that keeps our enemies away. But the important thing is that we remember that we're not safe because we are strong when we have this hedge around us, right? When there's a hedge around us, it's not that we're strong and able to do something about it. It's that the hedge is there, right? There's nothing about us that keeps us safe. It's where we are. It's very easy to believe when you're in that hedge to think, I'm safe because of who I am. I'm safe because anywhere I go, anything I do, I'm going to take the hedge with me. That's not how hedges work. You have to be near the homestead to be able to be safe. And our enemies know that we are safe because of the thorn bush. Now, as a youngest child, I really loved to take advantage of it where I knew what safety was. I could get into some mischief, I could taunt my siblings, I could do whatever I wanted, and as long as I got to my parents or my grandparents, I was going to be safe. It didn't matter what I had done. It didn't matter what I had said. If I got to that place, I was going to be safe. Now, this was very short-sighted. When you're a little bitty guy, you don't realize that you're going to leave that safe place at some point in the future, right? When you're beside mama, you can make faces and you can say whatever you want. and nothing's going to happen to you. But you're not going to live right beside mama. Eventually, you're going to come out from away from her, and then they're going to have a long memory. Those older siblings have a tendency to know exactly what you did even hours later, maybe even days later if you've been particularly careful. They understood that they could patiently wait for me to come out. And that's what our enemy does. Satan very carefully waits you out. You can get right up there next to your Father, and you can stay in His presence, and you can trust in the hedge that God puts around you. But when you decide, I don't really need to be in God's presence anymore. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to do my own thing for a little while because I'm going to be safe because I've got the blessing of the Lord. The enemy's waiting on you. He set traps for you. Because if you decide that you're going to be safe on your own, you're going to very quickly find out the other way. But that leads to the question for me, if God put this hedge of these Ishmaelites around His people, why didn't He just eliminate the enemies that would have caused them a problem? Why did God have these foreigners that would have caused Israel a problem there? He could have just wiped them out. Why did He want there to be enemies? Why does God want us to have enemies? Yeah.
You just gave me another existential crisis.
Well, I think it's a good thing to think about because many times we think that God couldn't have anything to do with those enemies, right? We think that there's no way that there's any connection to any bad thing out there or any dangerous thing out there and what God wants to do in your life. But God can use the bad intentions of other people to draw you closer in, right? Yeah, like Joseph and his brothers. God is able to use someone else who is your enemy and say, you need to come closer to your Father. You need to stop running out there and doing what you want to do. Encountering enemies leads us back to God. And so the Lord tests us to refine us. Now, we sometimes like this idea of the hedge of protection with the thorns outward, right? We like the idea that the enemies can't come in and get us. What we don't like is that all hedges that God makes have thorns on the inside, and that those thorns on the inside have an entirely different purpose, right? Many societies around the world figured out that an easy way to create a livestock boundary is to plant a bunch of shrubs. That you stack up these plants, you get them thick enough, and you don't have to build a fence. You don't have to go to the expense and the trouble of building something out of stone or cutting down enough wood to be able to make your own fence. You can just have a thick enough hedge. Now, as a child, I loved to climb fences and go running and exploring all over the place. But you learn very quickly, there's no easy way through a thorn bush, right? If you decide you're going to cross that thorn bush, you're going to very quickly regret it. Even if you're a foolish little child and you bring yourself a hatchet or a machete and you decide, I'm going to get through that, you very quickly figure out it doesn't matter. The thorn bush is going to attack you every time you attack it, right? All you have to do to get hurt by a thorn bush is go near it.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything else. The thorn bush doesn't care about you at all. It doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care about your determination. It's just going to start pricking you. The thorns of the Lord are designed to be painful. There are some of us who see a boundary marker that God has put down, and we say, oh, well, I'm just going to go right across that. When you see the boundary that God has set, and you decide that you're going to go across it, don't be surprised when a thorn sticks you. Don't be surprised when something that God has placed there gives you a bit of pain. And what we see is that God's thorns, the Ishmaelites, are placed at exactly that position. Not only in that area over there towards modern Saudi Arabia, but they are placed where the temptation was for God's people. Because throughout the Old Testament, God warned His people again and again not to return to Egypt. He said in Deuteronomy 17, way back at the beginning of when His people were going to get the promised land, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. So before they even are settled down in the promised land, God says, be careful you don't go back to Egypt. And then we see in the prophets, in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and several other places, that God is condemning the people either for going to Egypt or for wanting to go to Egypt. So again and again, God says, stop longing for Egypt. Because right after they came out of Egypt, all the way back in Numbers, we saw where God started telling them, you have to quit desiring the things that I have brought you out of. And these people had wanted to go back to Egypt at a very early point. But the Kedarites, if you look in chapter 25, verse 13, the second of Ishmael's descendants is named Kedar, and from Kedar comes the Kedarites. And the Kedarites, as a tribe, end up positioned exactly in the path between Israel and Egypt. You can see on our map here that this area where the Kedarites end up is the exact path that you would have to take if you wanted to go back to the place that God has told them not to go. Now, when we pray for a hedge of protection, we shouldn't be surprised when God puts the thorn bush between us and what would hurt us. Herd animals, like sheep, will sometimes go straight toward danger. It's very easy for them to decide that the danger isn't really a problem. We are God's sheep, and He knows that we will gladly head right toward danger. Sometimes we find ourselves pressing toward things that are dangerous, and we feel His thorns, and we wonder, why should that hurt? Often you find yourself wanting something, longing for something. You've got something on your heart, and you think, God, why can't I have that? And if you reach out for it, suddenly something will prick you, and you'll wonder, why did that happen? Why is God turning me back the other direction? But God knows exactly what He's doing. If He's put a thorn in between you and what you want, realize that it's for protection. Realize that God would rather you get stabbed by a thorn than killed by a wolf. And so the Lord uses Ishmael's tendency to fight to keep enemies out and sheep in. Now, our brother Lee here pointed out that Ishmael is still causing some trouble, right? This is very popular in prophecy circles because we know that this is a prophecy that God has given all the way back in Genesis 16, that this is going to be a problem. Now, if you're not aware, the Quran, the basis of Islam, claims that Ishmael is the promised son instead of Isaac. And because of that, many modern Arab people say they are descended from Ishmael. If you meet Arab people, they will often say, I can trace my line back to one of these 12 princes that are listed in Genesis. It's a mocking corruption that's designed to attack God's true plan. But it's important we remember that every descendant of Ishmael is not God's enemy. Just because they have the genes of this man does not mean they are genetically determined to be God's enemy. Now, why can we say that? Because Ishmael wasn't God's enemy. So if the father of all of these people who are supposed to be fighting God wasn't against God, then why would the descendants be as well? We can see other examples like the Midianites. Those were descended from the good line, from Abraham, and there's no evidence that what he did with Keturah was in any way wrong. There is nothing in Genesis 25 that says that Keturah was wrong or that there is any negative consequence for Abraham taking her as a wife. But the Midianites come through that line, and yet, when the people of God are going through the wilderness, the Midianites come out and attack them. They are the enemies of God's people, even though they should have been friends, right? God punishes them for that decision. But then even closer to home, the Benjaminites, if you remember the story, they are doing some really awful things, and they end up getting in trouble so that the whole of the other tribes come and attack them. And then later, the Ephraimites, where the northern kingdom is all against God's people. So what we see is that it's not really just because they are outside the line of Isaac that they cause a problem. The Ishmaelites' problems are not because of what the difference between Ishmael and Isaac. As we saw earlier, those two brothers met peacefully to bury their father. And we can see that God didn't abandon Ishmael's children. He promised blessings to the mother, and there are blessings. But it's obvious that Ishmael was treated differently by God than Isaac, because Ishmael will only show up one more time in the scripture, when Esau, another brother who has some difficulties seeks him out. So Ishmael was not the chosen son, and some of his descendants are almost certainly modern opponents of Israel. It is almost certain that some of these people are right, that they are genetically linked to this brother very long ago. And this leads many modern Christians to assume that Ishmael is kind of a permanent stain on the legacy of Abraham and Sarah. But there's nothing in the Bible that says that Abraham was wrong to take Hagar as a concubine. Now, it is clear that he is not supposed to consider Ishmael the child of the promise, but God never condemns him for taking Hagar. There's a consequence that could be interpreted as Jeff was saying, that maybe this is a consequence for what he did, but there is no point where God says, hey, you aren't supposed to do this. But the Lord doesn't dwell, even if it was a sin, even if it was something that God had convicted him of and we aren't told about it. God doesn't dwell on our repented sin. Once we have turned our sin over to him, he forgets the shame and moves on to the restoration. God doesn't see Ishmael as a shameful mistake. That's a very difficult thing for us, because we think of these modern conflicts. We think of all of these troubles that these people are in and the wars that are on the news today, and we want to say, this is all Abraham's fault. This is all Hagar's fault. And that doesn't seem to be the Scripture's perspective. Because once we turn our sin over to God, God doesn't keep punishing us for it, even if there are consequences. And God certainly assures us that he is not going to punish our children for the sins of the fathers. Now, as believers, we sometimes feel ashamed of our mistakes, even after we bring them to God, right? As we were talking about at the beginning of class, God gave us a really sharp memory for our mistakes. He wants us to learn from them. He wants us to remember them. But he doesn't want us to still feel the shame for those mistakes. We don't need to think that we are still guilty once we have turned them over to God. If you see Ishmael as a shameful mistake, you're minimizing God's power. You're saying God isn't capable of working things out the way he said he would. Because God didn't say, oh, Abraham, you've made such a big mistake that I'm going to punish everyone in the world for the rest of time because of this mistake. That would be a pretty harsh God. That's not what our God's like. Our God is full of love. His mercies are new every morning. He's very interested in working with us. Now, this feeling that you have that Ishmael is a shameful mistake, it's not an accident. It's not by chance that so many people feel their mistakes. Satan would love for you to feel weak and small. He wants you to focus on the shame all the time. He wants you to constantly remember those things. He wants the mistakes to stand out really starkly in your brain so that he can kick you and say, hey, you remember how dumb you were? You remember how quick you gave up this supposed blessing that you have? You remember how quick you forgot whose father you are, who you have as a father? Abraham was God's child. He committed his life over to God, and he didn't want to keep focusing on this shame. God didn't desire for Abram and Sarai to use Hagar that way. There's almost no chance of that. It never suggests that Abram was supposed to do that. There's no indication that he was supposed to take a concubine and have a child outside of this promise, and especially not to try to put in his own plan. But just like Joseph testified to his brothers, God didn't design the evil, right? When Joseph's brothers throw him in the hole and sell him to slavery, there's no indication that God inspired them, right? There's no way that we see that the Holy Spirit didn't come upon Judah and say, Judah, you need to sell your brother over here into slavery. No, not any suggestion of that. Instead, God used their evil. He used what they wanted to do something good. Now, that's a very complicated thing for us because we think, well, what would God's plans have been like if it hadn't been for my sin? What would God have done if I hadn't fallen away like this? Because God didn't need Ishmael to create a thorn bush, right? If Abram and Sarai had never come up with this plan, had never created Ishmael, God would have protected his people another way. God would have done it in some way that we don't understand. So we have a kind of dilemma here where God is using our mistakes, but he didn't need them. He didn't want you to make them, but he will use them if you surrender. And that's a very difficult thing for us to think through when we're trying to think through our mistakes and we wonder, God, what was I supposed to do in this circumstance? What would it have been like if this? And we can go through all of these hypotheticals. We can keep ourselves awake at night when we're trying to sleep, thinking through what our life would have been like had we not made that choice, how things would have been different had we gone down this other path. And God says, don't worry about any of that. It's not an issue. Ishmael is not a problem for God. The shame that they felt was not a problem for God. And God doesn't want you to keep feeling that shame. It's a problem for us when we keep dwelling on that and we say, oh, but the consequences are so big. Oh, but I won't be able to make it if I keep having to deal with all of the fallout from everything that's been going on because of that one mistake. God says that's not what's going on. God's not going to punish you for the rest of your life because of some mistake you made. There may be consequences that continue for the rest of your life. But once you turn those consequences over to God, he begins to use them in beautiful ways that are totally unexpected for you. When Hagar gets this prophecy that her son, who has not yet been born, is going to be a fighter, is going to be someone who is in the way of everyone else, I'm sure she wasn't excited at first. I'm sure no mother wants to hear that, wants to be told, your child isn't going to be loving. Your child isn't going to be easy to get along with. He's going to be difficult. And then he doesn't say anything else. We don't know what Hagar found out. We don't know if she ever got to find out that God was using her son Ishmael to protect his people, to protect his promise. But what we know is she trusted that he heard me. She trusted that he's faithful. And we see, even if Hagar didn't live to see it, that God was faithful. If you yield to him the thing that you are most ashamed of, it can become a beautiful part of his kingdom. God doesn't just forgive our sins, he heals them. The verse that we often quote that was a prophecy about Jesus that's quoted in the New Testament, Isaiah 53:5, tells us he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed, or by his stripes. So many Pentecostals quote that, right? When we have a physical problem, we say, by his stripes we are healed. And that's a wonderful promise to claim. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But keep in mind that Isaiah 53:5 is not first about physical illness. It's not first about you having a difficulty, even a serious difficulty that's a terminal illness. That's not what it's first about. It's first about your sins. When Isaiah 53:5 was given, God is saying, this is about your transgressions. This is about your iniquities. Jesus is healing your iniquities. He is healing your mistakes. That's such a powerful idea. He's not willing to overlook them. Jesus isn't taking your sin, isn't taking your mistake, looking at it and saying, okay, I'm covering it with the blood of Jesus. We're never looking at that thing again. Jesus looks at your mistake, covers it with the blood of Jesus, and says, this is going to be great in my kingdom. I'm going to do something spectacular with what you've just given me. And that's such an amazing idea. Something so special that the blood of Jesus doesn't just destroy our sins, it transforms them. Something like Ishmael goes from being a mistake, goes from being something that when you hear the obituary of Abraham and you say, oh my, come on, this is a great man of faith. What are we doing? Bringing up this big mistake. He's just been dead for an hour or two. And here we are talking about Ishmael. Can't we give the guy a little time to rest in peace? And God says, yeah, I want to bring up the mistake because I guarantee you that Abraham wasn't ashamed of Ishmael. I guarantee you that when he saw him side by side with Isaac in the peace of God and in the prophecies of God, that he was proud of him. That the son he had to send away has become the father of 12 kingdoms. that the prophecies and promises of God are true. God promises that the punishment of Jesus Christ will make us whole. If Abraham perfectly obeyed, Ishmael would never have been born, right? If he had just trusted, there would be no Ishmael. But God perfectly works Ishmael into his plans because Abraham turns him over to God. Because it's God who says in chapter 17, you need to send this son away. It's another time, just like we talked about last week, where God says you have to give your children up. Every child of God that Abraham was given, God asks him to give up. That's such an intimidating thing. He has to send away Ishmael. He has to send away the sons of Keturah, and he has to sacrifice Isaac. He has to be willing to give up everything that God has given him. And he's willing. God didn't forget about Ishmael even after the death of this son. In a description of the New Jerusalem, God includes Kedar and Nebaioth, the first and second born of Ishmael. In Isaiah 42:11 and 12, it says, let the desert and its towns lift up their voice, the villages that Kedar inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing for joy. Let them shout from the tops of the mountains. Let them give glory to the Lord and declare his praise in the coastlands. God is saying the descendants of Ishmael, this thorn bush, this product of sin, is going to sing his praise. God prophesies they will be there. And in Isaiah 60 verse 7 it says, all the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. They shall be acceptable on my altar, and I will glorify my glorious house. God says the children of Ishmael will be in his house. They will be acceptable as worship for him. That's such a beautiful thing. It's so amazing that God looked at the mistake and he decided to incorporate it into his kingdom. Ishmael was originally a mistake, but God can use inconvenient people. He can use difficult people. The Lord can use our shameful things and make them into glorious works. It isn't enough to just let go of our shame. We can't just say, all right, God, I'm tired of being ashamed. I'm tired of having this come up in my life again and again. It's not about forgetting it. It's about transforming it. It's about saying to God, do what you want with this. I'm tired of being ashamed of it. I want to see your glory through it. I want you to use it however you want to. Be willing to humble yourself and return to your mistakes and trust God will use them to make something beautiful. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
I want you to know you have blown my theory of all that, the story. I had it in my mind.
Well, I want to be clear, I'm not disputing that the Arab people are currently fighting God's people of Israel. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is there is room in heaven for every Arab.
But what Abraham did, I've always been assumed, we can get in trouble with assume that God disobeyed God.
Sure.
Or rather, Sarah did.
Yeah.
Sarah told Abraham.
And we're just not told. And so in Genesis and most of the Torah, the first 5 books, we simply don't get an explicit description of most choices. Almost anything that someone does, right or wrong, we just get told the story. And then it's up to us to draw the conclusion. Did they do what is right or did they do what is wrong? And it's not designed that way. And we'll see in a couple of weeks, one of the only times where God comes right out and says, you did evil. Well, in a situation like that, when it's so unusual, we certainly should pay more attention to it. But it doesn't mean that it isn't wrong. It just means we don't have a verse where we can say, God told Abram, don't go over here with Hagar. He just didn't say that we are told.
I was assuming he did.
Sure.
They just didn't write it down.
Yeah, so when he goes through with the plan, then God says, I'm not doing that. Because Abraham, once he has waited long enough and he has this consequence of Ishmael, He's waited and says, God, I'm tired of waiting. I need you to just make Ishmael the promised son. And God says, nope, I'm not doing it your way. I'm doing it my way. Because I'm not going to let you get the credit for what I'm going to do. But it doesn't say Ishmael was a product of sin or something as clear as what we would like. Sure. But I do think that it is a sinful thing because God had promised it specifically, you're going to have a child through Sarah. So if he says it's going to be through Sarah, you don't need a substitute. That's not how that works. So we've talked before, if God tells you this is a promise, don't change the promise, right? You don't get to substitute your words and conditions in and say, well, God probably meant to do it this way. You do it God's way.
That's the way I was approaching it.
Sure, I think you're right.
So interesting that I think Satan uses a manipulation of the story. It's not like Ishmael himself or Ishmael's descendants themselves, but it's Satan's lie about who was the promised son and how that should be venerated that has shipwrecked so many thousands of people
Sure.
over 1400 years in the corrupt telling of the story. It's not the people.
Yeah.
And it's not what they served as God's hedge for.
Yeah.
But a lie about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And I think it's almost that if it's about God's promised son, Isaac, it has to be on God's terms, right? The covenant with God has to be exactly the way he says, but by changing it to Ishmael, suddenly they can change the terms of the covenant. And they can say, this isn't about being close to God and obeying his word. This is about whether or not you're good enough. And we're going to make it a totally different kind of thing. And it is kind of fascinating that they make it about being doing good works when Ishmael is not a good work. But
Just hearing you in that discussion, it makes me think how many things happen in the world today that God allows because he is going to get the glory and the credit for the outcome and not us. Like
sure.
if he intervened quicker in Hurricane Helene and it didn't go to North Carolina, then he wouldn't have gotten the glory. I mean, I've been told now that they're turning away clothes and bottled water up there because they have so much they can't store it.
Wow.
So I mean that's a glorious thing that people have come together to help communities like that with so much help that they can't even give anymore.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, how many things happen in this world and we look at it as, well, where was God?
Yeah.
And God's up there saying, if you'll stand back and let me, you'll see me work, and we get in such turmoil about the events. I mean, I guess we could use that in the election, so many people are so wrecked with anxiety about this election, and it's so publicized and so much conflict from both sides that, God's probably saying it. Y'all just shut up the media, stop watching it, and let me work.
Yeah.
But we don't, we don't follow that. We gotta know, we gotta know, we gotta know.
Sure.
And so how much of our lives are affected because we're so quick to want God to answer, and He's not gonna give us that because then we would claim it for us.
Sure. And I think generally that it's very difficult for us to not either go ahead of God or lag behind God. That we are constantly impatient or lazy. Whatever our tendency is, that we have a really hard time staying right beside God's Spirit. And that's a major part of the Christian life, is learning to keep right beside Him and not try to do something on our own times and insist that it be our own way.
I think I struggle with that with prayer because I don't hesitate to pray for the same thing, but then I let that thought come into my mind. When you pray for that, you gotta wait for God to give it to you.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
for it, or trust God to handle it because I've already prayed for it, or
Yeah.
does God want me to continue to?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because that's our literal next story is about how much you should pray for the same thing and whether you should kind of thing. Yeah.
I think you should also remember that when you're in your prayer and you're seeking God for answers, that you thank Him
Yeah.
because He heard your request.
That's right.
He's not deaf.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean you can't come back and bring it to Him again, but always give Him praise and
Sure.
thanks for hearing us.
Yeah.
And, answering our prayer.
And I think as we mature, we kind of get a sense for what is an appropriate time to wait. It may be for some requests that's multiple times a day. It may be for others that you need to wait several months before you feel at peace again to bring that back to God. And learning the difference between what is worry and what is forgetfulness, that's a really difficult thing for us to balance. But as we mature, we get more comfortable with kind of the ebb and flow of the Christian life of when we should bring our urgent needs, how often.
For me, so I have, before I leave